So let me not to agree with Piotr because formally it's day number 3, and yeah, it's the hardest one. I hope you had a good party yesterday, but I hope you don't feel like this guy. So drink your water or whatever, and let's start. So yeah, okay. My name is Ivan Nemytchenko, and my Twitter handle is Animation. And I'm originally from Russia, but last 5 months I live in Serbia. And I had to say that I found that Polish is actually much more close to Russian than Serbian. But guys, you did something wrong with your numbers. It's completely wrong. So a little bit about me. So I came to Rails from PHP. It was a long time ago. And I co-founded 2 agencies. I co-organized 2 conferences. I did a lot of management stuff as well. But currently I'm just a Ruby and Rails developer, so I'm just a freelancer. And the biggest contribution to open source, my contribution, is the idea of the gem called Tequila, and the idea was to have something like HAML but for JSON. And later, the author of Rubble was inspired by this gem and made Rubble, and now we have a really great tool for that. So I hope this counts as a contribution to open source. So, but anyway, let's start. So I was a Rails developer, and I was pretty amazed by it when I switched to Rails from PHP. And it was kind of simple, and you just know where to put your stuff, and yeah, kind of this. And I was pretty sure that I will follow Rails convention. I will apply Rails best practices. It will be just enough to make to build complex applications. But from time to time, I noticed one pattern, and it was like this one. So, oh no. Imagine this Ruby is our application, and this Rails is the timeline of our development process. And at the beginning, our application is clean and shiny, and you see it's levitating on Rails, and it can go forward very fast. Yeah. And you add some stuff, some gems, some functionality, and it fits perfect. And your application starts to look even more beautiful and can go forward even faster. But then you keep adding stuff because your customers ask to, and some of the stuff don't fit as well, and you might start using some glue and some nails to stick things together to make them to work together. And at this moment, this construction already can't go so fast, and you start to notice it. And if you keep doing it, you might find yourself in this situation where you added so much stuff that this construction can't go forward without very significant efforts. And the statement number 1, knowing how to do it in a Rails way, it is not enough to do really complex web applications. And when I realized that, I started to Google, to research, to explore the subject, and I quickly was able to find all those things. So solid principles, design patterns, refactoring techniques, and stuff like this. And this was definitely useful, but sometimes I found myself then I was watching some video from the conference, and though I was completely agree with the author, I was amazed by the beauty of his code, I was not able to apply those things in my code. I just didn't know how to do that. So the statement number 2, knowing about something and doesn't mean how to apply it. And this is where my story actually begins. Let me drink. And the story begins with the client. And the client came with a problem. And the problem is exactly the same. He has exact same application like I showed you on the picture number 4. So he has a team, and the team stuck, and the team of 3 developers tries to push development forward, and the customer, who's a project manager, tries to push all them together, and it still goes very, very slow. So the problem current team stuck. And the project itself is a monolithic Rails application with a MySQL database of 70 tables. And this was kind of smart client, so he came with a solution. He decided to split frontend from backend, and he already had a team of AngularJS developers, and my role was to build an API on Rails. And one thing that we had to keep that database structure because old application and the new one should work in parallel for some time. And I liked that idea. At that moment, I already liked the idea of separating things from one to another. And I signed the contract, and when we start to work on the new application, of course, we start with the models. And why it's so? We start with the models, and they can be pretty simple, but when we have legacy database, of course, we need to put some stuff, some additional attributes into our models definition and associations definition. And sometimes it can be really kind of hard, but when you did it, you already can access your data and you can work with it. It's okay. And as the next thing, I decided to take Rubble. So I will not be sending the unprepared data, and I will not replicate the complexity of the database to the client. So it worked pretty well, and we are ready to implement some features. And here goes feature number 1, user's registration. And so client gave me a task, and I realized that in our system we have 3 different type of users, and they kind of have different registration forms, but they are still stored in the single table. It's pretty common, but and we kind of have a solution for that in Rails. So conditional validations, of course, but I Googled for it, and for some reason, I don't know how to explain this, but yeah, but actually it's not the point. The point is that if you try to look deeper at the problem, so you might see that the problem is that we are going to build a model which knows how the data is saved, and it knows how 3 different forms should be validated. So we have a user data, and we have 3 separate forms. And at that moment, I was already familiar with SRP, so this kind of worked for me like a trigger, and I remembered about a thing called form objects, and I was able to, I tried them, and they fit perfectly. So it is very simple. It is almost pure Ruby object. So you just need to include active model validations to be able to validate your data. And I used Virtus just to make my life a little bit easier. So to have types coercion and stuff like this. And again, in a controller, you just put your params into this input object class. I call them inputs because I didn't have real forms because I was working just with the API. So you put your params into the input, you check if it's valid, and you just create your user record if everything is okay. And that's it. So I was able to remove validations from my active record models completely. Might sound scary, but it worked perfect. So the pro here is that we now have 4 separate small objects instead of 1 complex. But in this simple approach, you might have a problem when you try to work with nested forms, because it's kind of it might not work. You should consider something like a ref form or maybe some other solution in this case. But for me, it worked well in this case. And the next feature is a little bit more complex, and it's called redeem bonus code. And this means that I come with some bonus code with some number, and I give this bonus code to the system, and system should add some amount on my account. And it looks simple, but we should do some checks before we can actually do this operation. And those checks are that we should check if the bonus code actually exists, and if it's not used yet, and if the recipient exists. And this is how this code can look in our controller. And if it's not exist, we just send error message with the status and forget about it. If everything is okay, we actually do our stuff. We mark our bonus code as used and increase the balance. And if everything is okay, we just return the balance, new balance to our client. And this is the whole thing. And what could be wrong with it? If you, again, think about responsibilities, you might notice that here we have business logic and we have some controller stuff, just like rendering. And if we mark it with the color, so you can see that it's kind of mixed. So in orange, it is controller's responsibility to send the data and the statuses. And in the blue one, this is a business logic. And it's kind of bad thing to have. And one day we were told that we should have skinny controllers and fat models. So let's move this to the model, right? Where should we put this? It always was kind of a big question for me. Should I put this in one model or another, in bonus code or in a user? But there is no right answer on this slide. And again, I was kind of read about all the stuff, and I realized that this is a good case for a thing called services and use cases, or somebody called them iterators. And if you see, we have the same business logic here. It's a Ruby class again. And if something goes wrong, we just raise an exception, different exceptions. And if everything goes well, we return a value. And this is our controller code. So controller just knows what use case to call, what values to pass, and he knows how to treat an exceptions. And that's it. That's pretty simple, and responsibilities are separated. And the pro here is that we're not mixing responsibilities. And another good thing that we're not dependent on active controller here. So we can use that business logic somewhere outside of the context of the Rails. For example, in some command line tool or whatever. And the con here is that somebody might say that using exceptions for flow control is a bad thing. Yes, it's kind of slow, but for me it was okay, and I found this pretty expressive. So let's take a look at the whole picture. And before that, we had a controller and some coding in the method, and at some point it can send the error message. At some point, if everything is okay, value goes to the Rubble template and goes to the client. And with our construction, we now have this thing. So if the data is complex, it goes to the input class. If it's not complex, it goes straight to the use case. And use case sends an exceptions or returns the value. It can goes through the Rubble template and goes to the client. It's kind of we're not mixed everything in one place. We are separating thing, and it's kind of good. And we should be happy now. But remember, I said that we still have the legacy database, and this code, uh, everything is that it does. It just looks for two strings with original picture URL and resized picture URL, and it should go through three tables to reach it. And it was kind of bad thing to have because I realized that this database structure, it forces me to have those additional models, because in Rails your models is just a map of tables. So, and if you think about it in terms of domain-specific objects, actually, you might notice that those three things, they don't have any sense in terms of domain logic. So I just don't care about those things. I just want to have two strings in my profile. And it was just a single situation. There were more cases like this in this database. And yeah, these two classes looks like a good candidates for domain-specific objects. So I found that this is a good point to try a thing called repositories. And the idea of repositories goes with the idea of entities. And the idea is that the all persistence stuff now is only on the repository layer. So and the entity, you can think of it if you take active record model and throw away from it persistence, callbacks, and validations, and other things like this, then you will have your entity. Again, it's just a plain Ruby class. So, and the only thing repository does, it's whether saves your data and returns you an ID, or replies on some request. For example, you need to find some profile by ID or by some another more complex query, and it just returns you an entity or a collection of entities. So this is how they looked. This is how the entity looks. Again, this is just a Ruby class with Virtus. And for repositories, I picked thing. I was recommended to try SQL, and it was very good. I think it's a very good tool. It is very powerful for building SQL queries and working with the results. And methods in the repositories look like this. So this is a simple one. We just want to find the profile by ID. And we just, we should specify the columns here by ourselves. And once we get the result, we just wrap it into the entity object. And you see this line, this method goes to another table and gets some roles for that user, and we just add them as an attribute to that object and return it. So in the business logic code, there will be no such thing like a role model. So this is a little bit more complex. So this right here, it goes. We need to join two tables, and this is a gender table. for some reason they decided to store gender as an ID, as an association, and the profile status. And yeah, we need to append some extra fields here, but again, when you did it, when you realized how to build this SQL query, and it works. And I realized that it's kind of good thing to remember how SQL works. So as for persistence, it's again a little bit more complex because we wanted to forget about the IDs, about the gender ID and the status ID, and we have them just as two attributes in our entity. But when we go into persist this object, we need to go to the database and ask for ID, and this is two first lines. We're doing just exactly this. So we need to get those IDs, or if there is no such records, we should raise an exception or something like this. Depends on our needs. And once we did it, we just prepare the hash of the keys, and we just insert that hash, and you see that we had to manage things like creating it and updating it ourselves, because there is no Rails magic anymore. We are responsible for everything. And here's the con. There is no active record magic anymore, and you had to write a lot of low-level code by yourself. But the pro is that there is no active record magic anymore, and you understand what's happening there, and you have full control on what's happening there. And the goal was achieved, so the messy database structure was only on that layer of repositories, and the rest was kind of DDD. I mean, those entities, they were more like DDD, and I had the freedom to make them to look like I wanted. So as a side effect, I realized that I no longer need Rubble, because my structures I work with, they become clean, and in most cases I was able just to call to JSON and send the data to the client, and everything was perfect. But in some cases, you need to remove few fields or add some fields, and in this case, I found that idea of the presenter is pretty useful. So you see, you just pass in an object to Rob and the viewer, and in case this viewer is not an admin, we're just removing some secret fields, so it will not go to the client. And yeah, again, this is how we can call it. It's pretty simple. And let's take a look at the picture as a whole. And in a simple case, we just get our params. They go to use case. Use case works with the repositories. It makes some requests, and it does some logic. In case we need to store something, it makes a request to repositories again. And again, it can respond with an exception, or it can return a value. And in a simple scenario, this value goes straight to the client. In a more complex one, we might need to use an input for complex form, or we might need to use a presenter. But you can make a mistake here, and the mistake here might be the following. You might think that, okay, we had models, views, and controllers, and now we should have input, use case, repository, and presenter. But it's not that simple, and if you start to add, okay, we have a user, we should have a user input, we should have a user presenter, user repository. It's not that simple. You should think a little bit more, because you might have different repositories even for one entity. You might want to separate your, to apply some CQRS and something like this. So that's it. And at this point, I realized that the thing I built, it's not dependent on Rails anymore. So I was able to move some functionality to Sinatra without any pain. So that's kind of a point of my talk, and I want to recommend you these two tools. So SQL, I think it's a very great tool, and Virtus, you should use it. And those two things, I think they're worth to take a look at them, because with ROM-RB, I think I haven't tried, but probably you don't need to make your own repositories. Right now, you can just use ROM to to map some fields, and this might work well. And when I tried Lotus, I found that it is very close to what I built. I don't mean that this simple thing is a Lotus, but the idea is quite similar. So you're building almost pure objects, and you're just aligning them in a proper way. And I recommend you those two sources. The most thing I was talking about, I learned from those two blogs. It's Arkin's blog and Adam Hawkins' blog. And if you have any questions, please welcome.
Hello, thank you.